The 7 foods of the Promised Land. Have you ever noticed that God didn't describe the Promised Land with gold? He described it with food. 7 items, 7 signs, 7 clues of survival, prosperity, and strength for an entire nation. These foods were not chosen by accident. They sustain energy, protect the body, and have endured for millennia. Science is only now putting technical terms to what Scripture had already revealed 3,000 years ago. And here is the detail that almost no one catches. The last food on this list is called a symbol of abundance. But when used without wisdom, it can become exactly the opposite. Stay until the end. Stay, because each one of these 7 foods carries a layer that goes far beyond what you see on the plate. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 8. Moses is speaking to the people of Israel just before they enter the land God promised them. And he doesn't describe that land with castles or gold or invincible armies. He says, a land of wheat and barley, of vines, fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey. 7 foods, a precise list, an edible promise. Why did God use food to describe a place of blessing? Perhaps because the true wealth of a people begins with what they eat, with what nourishes their body, their mind, their capacity to produce, to fight, to last. Think about it for a moment. When God wanted to show his people what flourishing looked like, what a good life actually felt like, he didn't paint a picture of treasure. He painted a picture of a table, of a harvest, of a land that would feed them well. We're going to walk through each of these 7 foods, and you're going to discover that Scripture and science speak the same language. The first on the list, the most obvious, the most underestimated. Wheat appears hundreds of times throughout the Bible. In fields, in granaries, in offerings, in the bread Jesus broke with his disciples. In John 12:24, Jesus uses the very grain of wheat as a metaphor for the life that must die in order to multiply. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Wheat was not simply food. It was a symbol of cycle, of sacrifice, of harvest. From a nutritional standpoint, whole wheat is one of the most complete sources of slow-release energy that exists, rich in complex carbohydrates, fiber, B vitamins, and minerals like zinc and iron. It provides stable fuel for the brain and muscles for hours at a time. A nation that had wheat had endurance. It had the capacity to work, to build, to push through long days in the fields or on the battlefield. You can't fight wars, raise children, or build cities when your energy crashes before noon. Practical application. Swapping white bread for whole grain isn't a trend. It's returning to a wisdom that is thousands of years old. Barley comes right after wheat, but it has its own distinct story. In the Bible, barley was the food of the common people. Cheaper, hardier, it grew in drier and more difficult terrain. Ruth gleaned in the barley fields of Boaz, a foreigner surviving on what others left behind. Gideon dreamed of a barley loaf tumbling into the Midianite camp and flattening their tent, a symbol of the unlikely triumphing over the powerful. And in the Gospels, when Jesus feeds 5,000 people, the loaves are made of barley. The food of the poor becomes a miracle of abundance. Science explains why this grain was so highly valued. Barley is exceptionally rich in beta-glucan, a soluble fiber that lowers cholesterol, stabilizes blood sugar levels and feeds the beneficial bacteria in the gut. It also has one of the highest satiety indexes among all grains, meaning it keeps you full longer than almost anything else. In other words, those who ate barley stayed satisfied for longer, with a healthier heart and a well-functioning digestive system. It wasn't the grain of the wealthy, it was the grain of those who had the strength to endure. The vine is one of the richest symbols in all of Scripture. In Numbers 13, when the spies return from the Promised Land, they bring back a cluster of grapes so large that 2 men have to carry it on a pole between them. It was the visual proof of what the land could produce. You didn't need a speech, you just looked at the grapes. Jesus describes himself as the true vine. The psalmist speaks of the righteous man whose wife is like a fruitful vine. The peace of Solomon's kingdom was measured by the image of every man sitting under his own vine. No threat, no urgency, just rest and fruit. The grape was prosperity you could see, touch, and taste. Nutritionally, grapes, especially dark varieties, are dense in resveratrol, a polyphenol with anti-inflammatory properties and a protective effect on the heart. They are rich in vitamin C, manganese, and antioxidants that combat cellular aging. They also have a high water content, which means they hydrate while they nourish. But perhaps the deeper insight is this: a people with vineyards had roots, because vines take years to mature and produce well. You only plant a vineyard when you intend to stay. It is an act of faith in the future. The fig holds a unique place in the biblical narrative. It is there from the very beginning. The first thing Adam and Eve do after the fall is reach for fig leaves to cover themselves. And it is there at the end, in the prophetic vision of Micah 4:4, the image of the coming time of peace is every man sitting under his vine and under his fig tree, with no one to make him afraid. Sitting, shade, fig, peace, no fear. That's the picture. Not a palace, not a trophy. A fig tree and the freedom to rest beneath it. Scientifically, figs are among the fruits with the highest concentration of plant-based calcium. They are also rich in both soluble and insoluble fiber, potassium, B vitamins, and phenolic compounds with anti-inflammatory action. Dried figs, which were the most common form consumed in ancient times since fresh figs spoil quickly, have properties that today we know are beneficial for bone health, blood pressure regulation, and digestive function. A food of presence, one that asks you to slow down, sit down, and eat without rushing. If there is one food on this list that captivates by its appearance as much as by its content, it is the pomegranate. In Hebrew tradition, the pomegranate was a symbol of righteousness. It was believed to contain exactly 613 seeds, the same number as the commandments of the Torah. The hem of the high priest's robe was decorated with pomegranates, embroidered in blue, purple, and crimson thread. It was woven into the most sacred garment in Israel. It was the fruit of the law, of fullness, of sacred responsibility. Today, the pomegranate is considered one of the most studied superfoods in modern science. Its seeds and juice are rich in punicalagin and ellagic acid, compounds that show potent anti-inflammatory effects and protective action on the cardiovascular system and the immune response. Some studies suggest benefits related to prostate health and blood pressure reduction. Complex on the outside, abundant on the inside, each seed a benefit layered within the next. It's no coincidence that it symbolized fullness. It literally is full, to the point of bursting. Olive oil is perhaps the most sacred food on the list. In the Bible, oil was used to anoint kings and priests. It marked the moment when an ordinary person was set apart for an extraordinary calling. The tabernacle was lit by pure olive oil. The very name Christ comes from the Greek Christos, meaning the anointed one. The Mount of Olives, where Jesus knelt and prayed on the night he was arrested, is named for the olive groves that covered its slopes. The olive tree was woven into the most sacred moments of the entire biblical story. From a scientific perspective, extra virgin olive oil is one of the best documented foods in modern medicine. It is rich in oleic acid, a monounsaturated fat that protects the cardiovascular system, and in oleocanthal, a compound with anti-inflammatory action that some studies compare to ibuprofen. The Mediterranean diet, which is built on olive oil as its foundation, is consistently associated with lower risk of heart disease, dementia, type 2 diabetes, and certain cancers. Decade after decade, the research keeps pointing back to the same oil. Olive oil is not simply a condiment, it is a form of protection for the body, for the cells, for the years ahead. And Scripture was already using it as a symbol of divine favor long before a single clinical study was ever conducted. We arrive at the last item on the list, and it is no coincidence that it comes at the end. Honey is the most frequently mentioned symbol of abundance in the entire Bible. The Promised Land is described over and over again as a land flowing with milk and honey. The psalmist says that the words of God are sweeter than honey from the honeycomb. Jonathan dips the tip of his staff into honey and feels his strength return. Honey was the taste of blessing, of arrival, of reward after a long journey. And now comes the detail that almost no one notices. Proverbs 25:16 says, with startling clarity, "Have you found honey? Eat only what is enough for you, lest you have your fill of it and vomit it." Right there, inside the very list of abundance. A warning. The scripture placed a caution inside its own promise. The honey that is a blessing can become a saboteur, depending entirely on how and how much you use it. Science explains why. Honey is composed primarily of fructose and glucose. Raw honey contains enzymes, pollen, and bioactive compounds that genuinely benefit the immune system, have antibacterial properties, and assist in wound healing. The benefits are real and well documented, but consumed in excess it is sugar. And excess sugar raises blood glucose, overloads the liver, drives inflammation, and disrupts everything the other 6 foods were working to protect. The same substance. 2 completely different outcomes, separated only by wisdom. Honey is the perfect metaphor to close this list. The real blessing is not in the quantity, it is in the discernment. Wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olive oil, honey. When you look at this list as a whole, not as 7 random items, but as a single, intentional system, something becomes clear. There are slow-release carbohydrates for lasting energy. There are healthy fats that protect the heart and brain. There are fibers that care for the gut. There are antioxidants that defend the cells. There are minerals that strengthen bones. There are anti-inflammatory compounds that preserve the body over time. This is a food system, balanced, complementary, and intelligent. The Promised Land was not described as a place of easy glory or effortless wealth. It was described as a place where the body would have what it needs to function well, to endure, to sustain not one person, but an entire nation across generations. Maybe the greatest revelation is not in any single food on the list. Maybe it is in recognizing that caring for the body with wisdom has always been part of the design. And that scripture, written thousands of years ago, already knew this.